Welcome to the Ghost Legends of Madison County. I'm Mary Jo Middlebrooks, a member of the Jackson Area Business and Professional Women. In 2008, Jackson Area BPW organized the Ghost Walking Tour in downtown Jackson to fund a scholarship for women returning to college. Last year, we were unable to have the Ghost Walking Tour. This year, we asked Chris Stevens to produce this production as a gift to the community. Now, as Shakespeare would say, screw your courage to the sticking place and get ready to hear from the ghosts.
Good evening, and welcome to Ghost Legends of Madison County. I'm your ghost with the most, your MC, your master of chills, Dim Bones. I've been summoned from the ghostly netherworld to... You don't believe in ghosts? Spoiler alert, everyone sooner or later ceases to be. And sometimes, after our mortal shell is gone, our essence feels the need to rise from the grave so we can re-enter your living world. And tonight, I have a gathering of restless ghosts just for you. You're going to meet the ghosts of several former residents who helped shape our community over the past 200 years. Luckily for us, these residents love it here so much that they just don't seem to want to leave. Kind of like that one relative who needed a place to crash for just one night, but then refused to go away. At least our ghosts are well-mannered and won't ask to borrow for any money. Most of the ghosts we will meet tonight hail from Jackson's oldest burial ground, Riverside Cemetery, where the dead rest and sometimes play among us. Riverside holds some of Jackson's famous and infamous earthly remains. Plenty of unknown spirits also call Riverside home, their headstones and identities forever erased with the passing of time. So watch where you step during your next visit. Walking through the cemetery can put you in grave danger. The oldest known grave belongs to the daughter of Dr. William E. Butler. She died in 1824, giving the graves a span of 198 years. Straight out of Riverside, let's welcome our first ghost.
I'm Mary Jane Butler, and I reckon I can tell you about as good as anybody about Jackson Cemetery, because I was one of the first people to live here. We arrived on a flatboat when I was 5. My papa moved us here so we could sell land to new settlers. Everything we owned was on that boat, including my mama, my brother Billy, and all of our servants. We'd been on the river for days and days. When we hit land, Papa declared that we were here. Mama said, "Where? There's nothing here." But Papa was determined to build a home, and eventually, a town. Papa and his men set about building us a cabin to live in. Me and Billy weren't allowed to go far from the log cabin because Mama was afraid a wolf or a bear would eat us. The animals sometimes came right up to the house. Pretty soon, other people moved in, and we had a town. Papa was glad when the state officials named our tiny settlement after my Uncle Andrew Jackson. When I was about 7, I went to the new school for girls, and Billy to the one for boys. And we went to the Presbyterian church. I turned 8 just after the 4th of July in 1824. I thought the fireworks and the barbecue picnic was just for my birthday, but people told me it was for the whole country's birthday. I recall the tree leaves being yellow and red that day. I came home from school on a Monday. I had a fever and felt bad. Mama put me to bed, and my papa, who was a doctor, looked after me. But I kept getting sicker, and on a Sunday morning, while Mama and Papa and Billy sat with me, I just slipped away. That's how I became the first one to be buried in the Jackson Cemetery.
What a sad story. Jackson's first burial was a child. Death and funerals are such grave affairs. Our next ghosts are 2 more earthly Jackson settlers, and their stories are nowhere near as sad as Miss Mary Jane's. Take it away, boo-tifuls.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to meet you. I'm Mrs. Mariah Childs Bigelow. I was born in 1794 to a well-to-do family from Lynn, Massachusetts. My parents saw to it that I become educated and I studied to become a teacher, a profession I absolutely adored my entire life. In 1814, I accepted a teaching post in Nashville at the Robertson Academy, which was one of the first and finest educational institutions in the South. 5 years later, I met my husband, Elijah Bigelow. He was a dashing young man of good Christian values, a graduate of Harvard University, and he worked as an assistant editor for the Nashville Gazette. We took our sweet time courting while we could, so we could concentrate on our individual vocations. In 1824, Elijah received an offer to become the editor-in-chief of a brand new newspaper, the Jackson Gazette, in a brand new town, Jackson. And he asked me, should he accept, which I replied to is yes. He then immediately proposed marriage, which I replied to as yes. We agreed that I would stay on teaching while he went to Jackson. Then he would send for me after he settled, and I was so excited to join him as a pioneer in the wilderness of West Tennessee. Now, the Jackson Gazette was published by Mr. Charles D. McLean and Mr. Edward Hayes. The first issue was pressed on May 29th of 1824. Jackson wasn't always called Jackson. When the first settlers arrived in 1822, the original name was Alexandria. It was named after A.R. Alexander, whose home was the original meeting site of the First County Court. Later that year, the town was named Jackson, renamed in honor of a war hero, Andrew Jackson. A few years later, he was to become our 7th United States president. In those days, everyone lived in log cabins, and the construction of the log cabin that housed the courthouse cost $135. There was a beautiful fence surrounding it to keep out the animals and such. In the summer of 1824, I arrived in Jackson to become the new teacher at the girls' school. The city leaders had decided early on that boys would have their own school and the girls would have their own. One of my first students was Mary Jane Butler, a beautiful ray of sunshine she was, a life cut short too soon. Her father, Dr. Butler, had the blacksmith to strike a tiny frame. Elijah and I married on New Year's Eve in 1824. Our first home was a log cabin, 2 rooms and a loft. Unlike many of the early homes, we had wood plank floors and glass window panes. We welcomed 3 wonderful children, Eliza, Amanda, and Elijah, and we loved them more than life. After the new courthouse was built, the original courthouse was raised and the little iron fence was moved to Riverside Cemetery. Then Elijah built us a beautiful clapboard home on the edge of town. Now, the worst part of living near a river is the danger of malaria. Sadly, I lost my husband to that affliction in August of 1830, after Dr. Butler had done all he could. The children and I buried Elijah in Riverside Cemetery. Mr. McLean and Mr. Hayes offered me Elijah's share, but I told them to hold on to that for a while. It was a good thing I did. 3 years later, they sold the newspaper to a new publisher for a pretty tidy sum. In 1851, my son Elijah died of malaria. He was only 20. His sisters and I buried him next to his father. The railroads arrived in the 1850s. Jackson exploded with new business and industry. People from all over moved to Jackson. That meant more children and more schools. Jackson was a true hub city thanks to the rails. I educated 3 generations of girls. My students learned reading, writing, spelling, penmanship, math, history, and geography. I added science, philosophy, and ethics to the curriculum for the older girls. We prayed and sang songs in class. I loved my students, And from the comments I heard at church and through the community, the girls reciprocated that feeling. I never remarried despite frequent offers. In my later years, I accepted a position as guest lecturer at the Memphis Conference Female Institute. The school asked me to lecture about my experience as one of Jackson's early lady pioneers. The students were eager to hear it, and I was mighty happy to tell it. One Sunday after church service, I laid down with a compress on my head. I wasn't feeling well at all. I died on January 21st, 1872. The school and the Methodist Church gave me a lavish funeral. They buried me next to my beloved Elijah. One passing word before I go: love. When you love, everything will be fine. Good night.
Well, hello there. My name is Nancy Russell. I moved to Jackson in 1822 with my family. There wasn't many people here living here then. Well, at least not till we arrived. I was one of 14 children. My father was Major Charles Seaver, nephew of John Seaver, the first governor of Tennessee. Now, my father never really cared to run for politics for himself, but he was of the Democratic Party for several years in Madison County. Well, his excitement was so much when James K. Polk ran for president, he ran out and got a white bull and covered him from head to toe in pokeberry juice. Oh my goodness. Now the ladies, we would entertain ourselves. We would gather up picnic baskets and go down to the Forkadere River and see all the new merchandise coming in. Well, I can still see the children up in the trees and hear the music playing. Why, it was the music that brought my Jesse and I together. Jesse Russell, that was his name. I met him at a dance. I was 17 and he was 20. Squire Taylor married us in Jackson in 1832, while we were the very first couple to be married in Jackson. And our son Robert was the first natural-born citizen of Madison County. Jesse and I went on to have 8 children together, 45 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. My goodness. Jesse and I, we always did love Jackson, and we were lucky enough to see Jackson build itself up again after the war. Now, one particular cold winter, we were visiting family in Brownsville, and I passed peacefully in my sleep in 1872. Jesse had me buried at Riverside Cemetery. He joined me 17 years later. Now, every now and then, I still like to come over and see what's happening in Jackson and take a little stroll around. So if you're ever downtown taking a little walkabout and feel a cold breeze just come out of nowhere, well, say a little hello. It might just be me.
Thank you, ladies. Our next ghost was a legend during his own time. He brought the railway to Jackson and was instrumental in the founding of a higher education. He was a lawyer, a judge, and a U.S. representative. Here comes the judge.
Good evening. I'm Milton Brown, Judge Milton Brown. I was born in Ohio in 1804, the son of a lawyer. And all 4 of my brothers and myself would continue that tradition of becoming lawyers. Around early 1833, my brother Hervey and I rode horseback from our home in Ohio to go to Nashville, Tennessee to study law under Felix Grundy of Grundy County. Along the way there, we run into a wagon train of people from Pennsylvania who were headed west towards Nashville, which was a booming city at the time. And I met a young lady by the name of Sarah Torrin. And little did I know that less than 2 years later, she and I would be married. I studied under Felix and got my lawyer, passed my bar exam in about 1835. And shortly after that, we got married, Sarah and I. I had just turned 31 and she was just barely 17. At first we moved to Paris, Tennessee, where we stayed for just a very few months, but we heard so much about the booming community of Jackson, Tennessee, so we decided to move to Jackson. and I put out my shingle and studied law, practiced law here. Wasn't but a couple of years later that I was offered a judgeship, which I took and really enjoyed. But then I ran for Congress in 1841, and I served in Congress until 1847. Now, one of the biggest concerns I had for Jackson was the economy, education, and religion. Those are very important. We worked on a railroad that would bring things from Grand Junction here to Jackson, and that really made our economy boom. We had products that came all the way from South America, brought into New Orleans by boat, and then put on a train from Mobile, and came up here, and we were getting fresh vegetables, all kind of other products that we had no access to before. We also had a lot of work to do towards the community. Now at that time, the black community would attend the church of their white owners. But that all changed after the Civil War. I attended the Methodist Church. Now, when we first moved here, there were 55 members, 42 whites, 13 blacks. But as a result, after the Civil War, the black community wanted to have their own churches. So we held meetings in the living room of my home, and we discussed that problem, trying to figure out how to resolve that so we could have the black community could have their own churches. And it was there I met a wonderful young man by the name of Isaac Lane, a former slave, who was very, very personable, really nice to be around. And we came up with the idea with the white and the black communities working together for the CME Church, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, Isaac realized if we're going to have black churches and put black men into these leadership roles, they're going to need a better education. So I helped him found the Isaac Lane Institute, and I supported that, and I became a board member, a trustee for the early days of Lane College. Now, also in that time, I was a supporter of the early days of what would become Union University, as well as what would later become Lambeth University. Dr. Butler here in town supplied the land. I paid for the construction of a building. So I've been heavily involved in the education here in this area. Now, the railroads. My career was as a president of, 3 different railroads. Started with the Mississippi and Ohio, and then later on what would become the Mobile and Ohio, and eventually part of the Illinois Central. Those brought a lot of jobs to Jackson, not just hard labor jobs, but professional jobs, skilled labor. We brought in products from all over the world. Bemis Bag looked at us as a resource where they could set up a mill here in Jackson and they could distribute their product all over the world by rail. I retired from railroading in 1879. 3 years before, 1876, I had lost my wife, Sarah. She and I had a total of 6 children together, 5 of whom would become adults. And then 7 years after her death, I passed away. I want to encourage everyone to get involved with the community.
Judge Milton Brown was so influential in the railroad business, a Pullman car was named after him. You'll find the last of its kind on display at Casey Jones Village here in Jackson. Our next spirit experienced horrors during the Civil War that haunted her the rest of her life.
I'm Karina Ann McCory, but you can call me Miss Pet. Everyone does. My mother, God rest her soul, died soon after I was born. A little slave girl named Martha tried her best to care for me. She called me Miss Pet. Martha was far too young to properly care for me, so my papa asked my aunt Musadora to come help me. She became the mother I never had. Papa's a very successful planter, so I received a good education. I looked forward to a life of happiness. Well, until the Civil War, when everything changed. Jackson was the first town in the state to raise the Confederate flag. Soon after, we had an army camp at the fairgrounds. My oldest brother Tom joined up. We girls sewed uniforms and presented flags to the boys to carry into the battle. It was all so patriotic, but Tom was one of the first boys to die in the Battle of Shiloh. My brother Henry begged Papa to let him join, but Papa said he already lost one son and he couldn't bear to lose another. In June 1862, the Yankees came to town. We had just come home from church when we saw them march in. We'd about 300 Confederate soldiers who put up a fight. Even though our boys were terribly outnumbered, they fought street by street. Once they got to our street, they needed ammunition. We had an ammunition wagon stopped in front of our house. So my Aunt Musadora and I loaded our aprons with cartridges and brought them down to the firing line. I don't know how many trips we made, but the Yankees shot at us the entire time. They missed. Papa died that winter and we were alone. Brother Henry was only 17 and anxious to go to war, but we couldn't stop him. He snuck into the Yankees line and joined. We didn't see him for another 2 years. When you go through war and you face death, you change. I was only 15 in 1865 and seeing too much. Horrible things I don't bear telling here, for I am far past the tragedies of those times. After the war, Brother Henry came home, but we had nothing left. The carpetbaggers came to town and took everything they could. We had soldiers there to keep the peace, but they were just as bad. Henry became a judge and was one of the most powerful Democrats in the state. In 1892, he was named the chairman of the Democratic Campaign Committee. But Henry's health began to slip. One time when he was terribly sick, I went with him to Hot Springs, Arkansas for the restorative powers of the springs. But he passed away there on March 24th, 1904. My sister Mary McCoy Freeman and I brought his body back home to Jackson. As for me, I just became so tired that one day I decided it was time to go. I walked toward Delight on January 10th, 1921. You'll find my gravestone at Riverside Cemetery in Thomas McCoy's plot number 345. But I'm not there, you know.
Oh, poor Miss Pet. Sometimes the living grow too tired to carry onward. Other times, death is quite accidental. Even the smallest amount of accidents can take a life in a matter of mere seconds. To tell you more about her unfortunate end, let's welcome another Riverside ghost.
How do? I'm Elizabeth Eubanks Irby. I'm not a native Jacksonian, but I've spent most of my life here. I was born in 1838 in Kentucky on my parents' estate near Perryville. I had 5 siblings and we led a very blessed life. My husband, Dr. Henry Clay Irby, was born in Fayette County near Memphis on the Mississippi line. He wasn't a physician. He was a highly trained educator. He graduated as a professor from Union University in Murfreesboro and taught at Gatewood Academy. We moved here to Jackson in 1870 and built a nice home on East Main Street. Henry Clay taught mathematics at Southwestern Baptist University, which was later renamed Union University. Henry Clay was a Democrat and his political views was a Knights Templar Freemason. He served as the secretary of Tennessee Baptist State Convention and was a clerk for several years of the Central Baptist Association. With my husband being so busy, I was a social butterfly, all about Jackson. Everywhere I went, they say, "Here comes Mrs. Dr. Irby." Every Christmas, I hosted a party at our church for the town's children in need. We'd serve a large meal, then every child would receive socks, shoes, and coat. We didn't have any children of our own, so the children of Jackson became like mine. Whenever there was a child in need, I was there. When my mother died, I inherited a large parcel of land in Kentucky. I sold it. From the land sale, I gave $25,000 to Union College and gave other monies to area charities. Henry Clay died in 1917 and is buried at Riverside Cemetery. We were wintering in Florida when he passed, and I brought him back to Jackson on a train. In November 1920, as I was helping making Thanksgiving preparations at the First Baptist Church, I fell and hit my head on the coal stove. It knocked me out cold. I never woke up. I was laying to rest at Riverside Cemetery next to my darling husband. I'm still restless and like to see how I can be of service.
Good day to you folks. I'm Mrs. Jefferson. I'm up here from Atlanta, Georgia, looking for my heart. Have you seen it? I need to find it. It must be here somewhere. You see, when the war broke out, both sides thought they would rush to battle, fight the big battle, and then return victorious. But the war just went on and on. My young son Sanderson and I stood with the rest of the women and children and watched with agony as our men folk left to go defend our homes against the Yankees. Sandy, I'll call him that, was just about to turn 14, but the minimum age for enlistment was 18, and I thanked my God in heaven for that. Sandy, my only dear son, was all I had. His papa left to ride with the Confederate cavalry and was killed at First Manassas. The next year was especially hard on Sandy. He missed his papa so much, and he wanted to join the fight, but he was still too young. One day he saddled his horse, told me he was going to the river down to fish. That was the last time I ever saw my son. Later, one of the Clark boys came home. He told his mama that my Sandy had joined the men and headed to Marietta, Georgia to become a cavalry trooper. I knew right then my Sandy wouldn't return home until he'd done some real fighting. Then one day, Mr. Taylor came with a letter from Sandy. My hands shook so hard as I could hardly open it. Sandy wrote to me that he was sorry for the way he had left me, but he thought it was best. He said his clothes were ragged and torn and asked if I could send him some new ones. I set out trying to find enough wool and material. Then I realized I didn't have buttons to sew on the uniform for my fighting young man. But my mama had saved the coat from my great-grandfather's Revolutionary War uniform, and it was in an attic trunk. I sewed those buttons on with loving care. I wrote Sandy and told him I understood why he left and why he did. I told him to stay safe and come home as soon as he could. I sent the letter, the uniform, and some warm socks to the quartermaster in Corinth, Mississippi, like Sandy had asked me to. I don't know if he ever got the uniform. The war ended, and all of the men came home except 3, and my Sandy. The oldest Clark boy came home and said he'd seen Sandy at the Battle of Britton Lane in Madison County in Tennessee. I came to Jackson and hired a man to take me to the place where the battle was fought. The old couple living in the cabin said many men were buried in the mass grave on the battlefield, and some were taken to a cemetery in Jackson. I didn't find his name on any of the headstones or markers at Britton Lane, so I came to Riverside Cemetery to see if I can find him. My Sandy never came home. I can't find his marker here, but I keep searching for my only son. Can you please help me search? Please help me find my heart.
Oh, another sad story. Poor Miss Jefferson can't rest. Night after night she appears looking for her missing son. During the war, many soldiers were buried in mass graves and in unmarked plots wherever a battle was fought. Her son is one such lost soldier. Perhaps one day they'll finally be reunited. Our next visitor was a young child during the war. Despite all the death and destruction around her, she lived a very happy and prosperous life here in Jackson.
Good evening. I'm Minnie Neely Murdoch. I was born in Madison County in August of 1861, just about 1 month after our awful Civil War began. I'm the only child of Dr. Moses Sylvanus Neely and Julia Niebuhr Neely. While I remember very little about Mother, she died when I was only 8. Father eventually remarried, and my stepmother was Louisa McClannon. Oh, I loved her dearly. Well, so did all of Jackson. Miss Lou is what everyone called her. She just doted on everyone. Father was a well-respected physician and druggist here in Jackson. During the war, he was a surgeon for the Confederate Army. After the war, he settled into a fine medical practice and established a drugstore. Later in life, he retired from doctoring and sold his pharmacy. With Jackson being a large railroad hub, Father became president of the Southern Engine and Boiler Works, which built locomotives and heat boilers. He was also a ruling elder in the First Presbyterian Church and was a member of the Odd Fellows. He died in 1914 and is buried at Riverside Cemetery next to Miss Lou, who died in 1885. Miss Lou was my best friend. She loved cardinals, especially those red male ones. When she got sick with cancer and knew her death was near, she told me to always look for the red cardinal. She told me that it would be her. I never paid too much attention to that statement. I was too busy growing up. But when I became a mother and I'd feel at my wit's end, there was always a cardinal flying past me, or in a nearby tree, or I'd hear its call off in the distance. Was it a coincidence, or Miss Lou, after all these years later, letting me know that everything will be fine? Well, I'll take the latter. I was married to a very nice man named Millard Francis Murdoch. He was a grocer. Before we were married, whenever I went to his store, he'd slip a little note into my order. Well, I was soon making excuses to go shopping, so I'd find a note when I got home. He finally slipped me a note asking me to a church social. I asked Father if I could go, and he replied, "Well, who do you think put that notion into his head in the first place?" My father was playing matchmaker all along. Millard and I have been a pair ever since. In 1880, we built a gorgeous Queen Anne-style home on East Main Street. Back then, Rutherford B. Hayes was the President of the United States. He oversaw the last of the Reconstruction after the Civil War. Millard and his two brothers, John and Bardwell, had come to Jackson from Mississippi to establish a grocery business. After the store became a huge success, Millard went on to become a traveling salesman of cut glass, and he made many trips to Nashville and throughout Tennessee. To keep me company while he was away, my father lived with us also. I like to keep a nice, neat, tidy home, but Millard, well, with all of his glass samples and whatnots, oh, he was just a disorganized genius. But instead of bickering about how to keep the house clean, we made it simple. Millard had his own office where he was free to do as he pleased, with all of his papers and knickknacks and whatnots, so all of them went immediately there. Happy spouse, happy house. Millard and I had two beautiful children, James Bradford, born in 1886, and Millard Francis. We called her Millie. She was born in 1897. Bradford went into the grocery business with his uncles, and we sent Millie to all of the best schools. It was quite unusual for girls to get such an education, but we believed a good education was important, and Millie taught kindergarten for a year. Then, in 1920, she married Dr. Francis Campbell Siemens, pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Huntsville. We went by rail to the wedding service. It was down in New Orleans, and it was such a lovely wedding. Millie and her husband never lived in Jackson as a couple, but they'd stop by for a visit as they crisscrossed the states during their church mission work. I lost my beloved Millard in 1927. I had a great marriage, and losing my husband felt like the end of the world, but I'm so grateful that I had it. I laid him to rest at the Riverside Cemetery, and 2 years later, Millie and Bradford placed me next to him.
Minnie, it's always good to see a happy ghost. Early into our bloody Civil War, the Northern Army took control of Jackson. Several buildings were burned to the ground by Union soldiers. When General U.S. Grant arrived the following day, he ordered his soldiers not to destroy any more of Jackson and to treat the Jackson citizens with respect. For a time, Grant set up his headquarters on Main Street along the railroad line. During the city's occupation, St. Luke's Episcopal Church was used as a hospital. The railroads transported wounded soldiers to Jackson from the battlefields of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. A Union soldier who died on the grounds of St. Luke's from his injuries still waits for his bride to come find him.
Corporal Josh Lambert, reporting for duty. I've been waiting for a mighty long time for my next dispatch to deliver, but no one ever comes. Are you bringing me dispatches? I want something to do here. I'm stuck here. How'd I get stuck here? Well, 2 cavalry troopers and I rode as fast as we could from Nashville to bring dispatches to General Grant's headquarters here in Jackson. Nobody could ever beat my time bringing important news. On my most recent ride, I took a mini ball to my arm from some low-down Johnny Reb hiding in the trees. Zing, and there it was. It hurt some, but I'm tough. I looked down and thought, well, I'm shot, but I kept on going. Hurt like heck, though. I left behind the 2 troopers down on the ground. They were my guards. Their duty was to protect me. I heard Jeffrey crying out for help, but I couldn't stop him. Robert, He was shot dead in the saddle. I had to keep going no matter what. I hated riding off without them, but orders are orders. I got those dispatches to Jackson. I was bleeding pretty bad when I got to General Grant's headquarters. He told me I'd done a fine job and it was time for me to get looked at. The Surgeon Stewart brought me home to this church where they were taking care of injured soldiers. My old horse Commander, he's the best, the fastest. There's nothing like feeling him run across the fields. He's my friend. I hope they're taking care of him in the stables. He likes good, fresh hay. I can't find the stables. Every time I look for the stables, the Stewarts bring me back to the church. I can tell Commander anything, especially how much I love and miss my beautiful bride Abigail. Abigail. I think of her all the time. Last time I saw her, she was standing in our yard in the rain, waving goodbye to me with tears streaming down her cheeks. I told her not to cry, that I'd be home soon, safe and right as rain. That rain was cold, but she wouldn't stay on the porch. She was drenched to the bone as I rode away. For the longest time, I kept a picture of her in my pocket. Somehow, somewhere, I lost it. I've been writing letters to her, hoping they'll send them north with the next rider, but no one's been coming to get the mail. The surgeon dug out that mini ball, and I was doing so good. I even started helping with some of the other men. I read to them. I helped change their bandages. Then one day, my arm got swole up and got hot and red. I kept it wrapped up, though, put water on it from the horse trough to cool it. Got to hurting so bad, though, I finally went to the doc. I hated to. He was so tired from working so hard. I didn't want him taking off my arm like he'd done to others. I said, "Doc, what you think?" Then I unwrapped it. The doc, he shook his head when he looked at my arm. Boy, the red streaks had just gone way up overnight. Even my side was red. He just looked at me, told me not to worry, told me to keep on reading to the others and write my letters to Abigail. So I did. But one day, I couldn't get out of bed anymore. I don't remember much after that, except I'm not in pain anymore. I try to leave, but I can't. So I keep waiting for Abigail to come find me and take me home. If you see her, will you tell her I'm waiting? I just want to go home.
Maybe one day, the ghost of Lambert's wife will appear and they'll be reunited. In the meantime, he'll continue his lonely search. Now you're about to meet a ghost who has a sorrow-filled mission. She's looking for someone, a very special relative, close to her heart.
Oh, hello. I'm looking for my cousin James. Have you seen him? No? Oh, he must be around here somewhere. Unlike my cousin, I lived a very blessed life. I am Mary Seipert Curtis, and I was born in 1835 in Bolivar of a Mr. William and Elizabeth Millshap Brim. Sadly, my mother passed away in childbirth, and my father died just a few weeks later. When he fell ill with fever, he asked his employer, Stephen Seipert, if he and his wife, Mary, would take me in. And they adopted me, and so I became their only child. Soon after, in 1839, we moved right here to Jackson. Father Seipert was a man of very strong opinions. You know, he even served in the War of 1812. He was even a chairman on the committee to incorporate Jackson. Yes, that was my father. Well, as the only child of a very prominent family, I had the prettiest dresses and the nicest china dolls. I was schooled in science, mathematics, history, geography, the arts, and yes, even refinement. Father and Mother Seipert loved me so very much. Soon after my 16th birthday, I was introduced to a Horatio H. Curtis. Oh, let me tell you, Horatio and I were smitten at first sight. We courted for a short time thereafter, but, well, in August of 1852, we were married. It was a beautiful 35-year marriage. I bore Horatio 5 beautiful children, 3 gorgeous daughters, and 2 strapping sons. Sadly, though, we only outlived 2 of them. Soon after, in 1855, I discovered I had a cousin named James, and he was 3 years my junior. But sadly enough, his mother and father died of pneumonia when he was just a little boy. I asked Father Seibert if he could locate him for me, and he said yes. He even had a friend of his provide James with an apprenticeship as a harness maker right here in Jackson. And although Father forbade me to ever tell James of our blood relation, James and I still became very good friends. Eventually, the war came in 1861. Unfortunately, all of my children were far too young to go to war. But James, well, James went on ahead and he volunteered instead of awaiting his inevitable conscription. And my sweet dear Horatio, he enlisted in the Army and became a paymaster. Oh, it was so sad that day. I stood on the railway platform with all of the other mothers and wives as we said goodbye. I said farewell to my sweet Horatio and my dear James. Out of the 12,000 Jackson sons that we sent off to war, less than 100 returned home to us. Yes, it was so sad. Eventually, my Horatio, when the war ended, returned home, safe and sound. But my dear, sweet James, well, that was another story. During the war, I wrote to Horatio almost every week, and once in a while I would receive a reply. But with James, it didn't matter how many times I tried to locate him. I was unsuccessful, and it pained me to think of how James could be so sad and lonely with no family to send him any letters. Eventually, a year after the war ended, James did return home. He had been captured in the Battle of Perrysville, Kentucky. And the last 2 years of the war, he was imprisoned in New York. So when he did return home, he was blind, lame, and pretty much out of his mind. With no family to take care of him, he wandered the streets of Jackson, a vagrant. Oh, how it saddened me to see him in that condition. How I had my servants provide him, bring him baskets of food and warm clothing. But it was never enough. And sadly, my poor James passed away in 1876 on a blustering, chilly day in spring. And I made sure that he was provided a proper burial and gravestone. I myself passed away in 1888. I died of pneumonia, and my dear sweet Horatio, he died in 1902. Horatio and I were buried together at the Riverside Cemetery. And although I lived a very long, peaceful life, I still have one regret, that I never told James of our blood relation and how he had a family that loved and cared for him very deeply. So here I am with this basket of food and clothing, searching for James. You have to help me find him. Won't you do that? James? James? Where are you?
Wasn't that a sad tale? I warned you I'd cry, but my tear ducts dried up long ago. How about a visit from a happier ghost? Or how about 2 for the price of 1? Yes, I know who will fit the bill. Here are the Hurt sisters, 2 of the wealthiest residents to ever live in Jackson.
Hello, my name is Annie Merriweather Hurt, and I was born here in Madison County on January 22nd, 1854. I'm one of 4 children of Francis and Eliza Merriweather. My sister Kate and I were exceptionally close. We never lived more than a stone's throw away from each other. My father was killed in a tragic accident in 1868 at the age of 39. It was a life gone too soon. My mother did go on to be married and lived in the house bought from Major Robert Bailey Hurt. who would eventually become my father-in-law. In 1872, I married Milton Brown Hurt, who was the Madison County Circuit Court clerk. Politics and civil service run in his family roots. After we were married, he moved into my mother's house, which had been his own childhood home. Milton and I had 5 children, 4 fine daughters and 1 handsome son who grew to be excellent citizens. We had 2 other little ones, James and Eliza. Our infants that did not make it past infanthood, and our Rebecca died in 1908 at the age of 20 from tuberculosis. Major Hurt, my father, was a Tennessee state representative and quite influential. He was from Virginia, but came to Tennessee as a young man, met and married my mother-in-law here, where he made his home. During the Civil War, he served as the chief of transportation under General Beauregard. After the war, he was instrumental in bringing the Illinois Central and Memphis and Ohio railroads through Jackson. My husband served in the Confederate Army, and at the very end of the war for a few months in 1864. But my brother-in-law, Absalom, joined in 1862. My mother-in-law tells an interesting story about a Union soldier named Allen Morgan Gear, who used to come visit her when Grant's soldiers had headquarters on East Main Street. He would exchange books with her from time to time and, on occasion, even talk politics. One day, Absalom, who was wearing civilian clothes, came to visit, and my mother-in-law introduced him to Gear. Gear was cordial and polite, and he and Absalom chatted for several minutes. Whether Gear knew Absalom was a Confederate soldier or not, but he chose to ignore it. I guess we will never know. Of course, if Gear wanted to raise the alarm, Absalom could have been arrested as a Confederate spy on the spot, but that didn't happen. On September 12, 1911, while enjoying a leisurely auto drive out near East Union with my daughter Susan and my son Robert, we somehow had a collision with a freight train. I don't remember hearing the whistle or even the sound of the engine roaring, just the loud bang. Our car was completely demolished by an engine of the North Carolina and St. Louis rail line. Robert and Susan suffered serious injuries. I died at 1 p.m. that afternoon. I was interred at Riverside Cemetery near Rebecca's grave, and those of James and Eliza, our infants. 3 years later, my Milton joined us there.
Good evening. Do you enjoy having electricity in your home? If you do, then my husband is the man you should thank. But he's not here. I think he's out having his own ghost adventure. Goodness, where are my manners? I'm Lucy Catherine Merriweather Wisdom. Everyone calls me Miss Kate. I was born in Fayette County in 1860 to Frank Merriweather and Eliza Elmira Hardy Merriweather. I had one older sister, an older brother, and a younger brother who was the baby of the family. My sister Ann and I were always close and never lived more than 1 city block from each other. Daddy died in 1869, so Mama moved us from Fayette County to Jackson so we could be near family. Mama raised us and taught us right. When I was 19, I married my husband, John Lee Wisdom. John and his brother-in-law, John Hughes Duke, owned a grocery store downtown on Church Street. It was a new store in 1874 when I was just 14. Mama would send me there for the weekly groceries. Sometimes I'd let little Frank tag along. John was 10 years older than me. He was always nice to me and my family. On my 16th birthday, John asked Mama if we could court. Mama said yes, but only Sunday evenings for an hour after supper. On my 17th birthday, Mama told John he could come over an hour before supper, dine with us, and visit for an hour afterward. Then, on my 18th birthday, John asked Mama for my hand. Mama replied, "When she's 19, you may." That year dragged on so slow. I wanted to get married. I was ready. But I had to wait and wait some more. As I waited, John and I looked for a plot of land to build our dream home. John was always interested in trains, and he fell in love with a piece of property on Main Street next to the Mobile and Ohio Railroad track. Problem was, the land belonged to Mr. A.T. Pegues. It was part of his front and side yard, and he refused to sell it. But John was bound and determined to buy that plot at any cost. When we got married, we first lived with my mama. Ann was married. My brother James died in 1877 at the age of 22 with malaria. So it was just Mama, me, John, and little Frank in the house. We had plenty of room. For the next year, John continued asking Mr. Pegues to buy that strip of land, but with the same reply, no. At night, John and I would lay on the floor in front of the fireplace looking at the house playing magazines. With the trains, we could get lumber and all the trimmings and furnishings delivered to us from anywhere. We just needed that perfect plot of land. One evening in particular, Mama made a rather rude comment that John and I needed to quit dreaming and build our house or go live in one of the hotels down by the railroad track. So, John jumped up and marched up the street to Mr. Pegues one last time. This time, yes. Yes was the reply. It cost us $1,200 but we got that land we wanted, and it was just one block away from Ann's home. John ordered all the materials, every nail, hinge, window pane, door panel, and doohickey to build that house from New Jersey. He hired all of Jackson's best craftsmen and artisans to build our home. In less than a year, we moved in. It had gas lights, hot and cold running water, and indoor flushing water closets. We had the first house in town to have such modern conveniences. I loved my home, especially my private bath with its large copper tub where I could soak for hours in that hot tap water. As John always says, happy spouse, happy house. We had 5 beautiful children, John Jr., Lorraine, Annie, Ray, and Catherine. We lost Annie when she was only 4, scarlet fever. We buried her at Riverside Cemetery. She has a lovely white marble cherub watching over her grave. Losing her was beyond painful. No parent should outlive their children. Next time you're at a cemetery or graveyard, take a moment and look. So many engravings memorializing children taken too soon. I'm happy to say the other 4 grew up to enjoy good lives. We were a very close-knit family with our home full of warmth, music, and laughter. We hosted many parties in our parlors. My sister Ann and her family were frequent company. John and Mr. Duke kept the grocery, but went into other ventures. They opened a bank. They established a municipal gas company so the city could have gas street lamps, and more residents could light their homes at night. They also invested in clean water and sewers for the town. There was a new invention called a telephone. John had one at his office at the bank. Soon all the banks had a telephone. Then most of the businesses installed phones. John installed a phone at our home on Main Street. We were the first Jackson residents to have one. I would call John at the bank to let him know when lunch was ready. Then he'd make that walk home to have lunch with the children and me. Soon other wives wanted a telephone in their homes like me. Did I mention John also owned the Jackson Telephone Company? Later, John and the other investors were key in establishing a municipal electric company. So, if you like your power, my John is the one you should thank. Sadly, John died at the age of 75 on March 21st, 1926. I died October 19th, 1949. We're buried together at Hollywood Cemetery. Stop by and visit us sometime. We love the company.
Now there's 2 happy spirits. When you've got it, haunt it. After the Civil War, it was time to rebuild Jackson, especially the railroads. Our next ghost is another Riverside resident who has some very strong ties to the local railroad industry.
Oh, hello there. No need to be frightened. I'm Ann Sharp Brady. I roam Riverside Cemetery with many other spirits, like little Mary Jane, who you met earlier tonight. I love Jackson, The railroad is very important to this town, as it was to my life. My father, Joseph Sharp, came from North Carolina and opened a dry goods store with his merchandise arriving by train. Even though the city was occupied by Yankees, during the war, a father was able to keep the doors open. He used to love to tell the story about the day the Yankees came and took all the rolls of ribbon out of the store, tied them to their horses, then ran up and down the street. My father also founded the First Methodist Church here in Jackson. My husband, Charles T. Brady, was born in Ireland in 1836. He migrated to Fall River, Massachusetts, but it wasn't much to his liking, and he ran away. He landed in Columbus, Ohio, and learned sign painting, and he was very good at it. Sometime later, he went to work for the railroad. When the war broke out, he joined the Confederate Army in Nashville and was assigned to Morton's Battery, Jackson Cavalry Division, commanded by Captain John M. Morton, Jr., who was the Confederacy's youngest captain of artillery. Now, the Battery boys were mighty proud of their big guns and named each one of them after a woman in the Bible. Being quite the sign artist, my husband painted each cannon name on its gun carriage. Our family was very well connected to the church. In 1872, my father sold the church and rectory lots to the Catholic parish. In October of 1883, we sold our property to the parish for a convent and school. We then moved to Hot Springs, Arkansas, seeking a better climate since Charles was ill. 3 years later, we came back to Jackson and bought a house on Middle Avenue at Baltimore in what was known as Irish Town. We opened our home as a boarding house for railroad workers. Both our sons grew up to become railroad men, Illinois Central engineers, and our two daughters, Martha and Janie, married railroad men. The men who boarded with us were like family. I remember particularly Bose Leslie. He was always cheerful and gave all the men nicknames. Bose brought with him one day a young man named John. He was from Kentucky. He was tall and handsome and very polite. And after some time of courtship, John asked my husband if he could marry our daughter Janie. We didn't say yes or no immediately. We said we'd discuss it. About a week later, my husband walked to town with John and said, "John, I like you, but I have just one objection to you as a son-in-law. You and Janie are of different faiths." John smiled shyly and said, "But it won't be for long. I'll be received into the church in a matter of days." Unbeknown to us, John had been studying Catholic instruction from Father Abbott in Jackson and another priest in Whistler, Alabama, at the other end of his run. His baptism took place at St. Bridget's Catholic Church in Whistler, where Mr. and Mrs. Bose Leslie acted as his sponsors. Janie married John at St. Mary's on November 25, 1886. Father Abbott performed the ceremony. Janie's sister Martha and fiancé William Sheehan were the bridesmaids and best man. Janie and John gave us 3 grandchildren, Charles, Helen, and John Lloyd. Their lives and mine seemed almost perfect. Then, at the turn of the century, Janie lost both her father and her husband. First, Charles died from a recurring illness. Then John in a tragic train accident where he sacrificed his life to save others. Without her father and husband, my Janie's life was changed forever. Although she continued her daily routine, she never missed a chance to talk about her husband's bravery. By the time I passed away 20 years later, my son-in-law, John Luther Casey Jones, had become somewhat of a railroad legend. I hear tell some folks still talk about him.
I urge everyone to visit the Casey Jones Home and Railroad Museum here in Jackson. There you'll see Casey Jones's historic home exhibits dedicated to Casey's life, including his famous last ride. And you'll see a 35-ton locomotive, which is very similar to Casey's own Engine 382. Oh no, guess what? Yep, you guessed right. It's hanky time again. Get 'em ready, we're about to meet one of Jackson's most mournful ghosts. She died in the most gruesome and horrific way imaginable.
I'm innocent. Can you believe me? Ah, but you don't know my story. I'm Eliza Woods. I was the cook for Mr. Jesse and Miss Mary Woods. Oh, Miss Mary. She birthed a baby girl that was born sick. She was baptized then and died a year later in March. It was 1884, and the wind was so cold the day Miss Mary buried her daughter. I thought that poor woman would grieve herself to death. I was just the cook, but I heard things. I saw things. I knew things. You see, Mr. Jesse, he wasn't right in the head. He would sometimes talk to himself in empty rooms. Miss Mary, she wasn't eating much. She was getting sicker and sicker, kept getting thinner and thinner. I just knew she was dying from a broken heart. I did my best to keep her alive. I fed her chicken soup, I made her mashed potatoes. Not much ever stayed settled on her stomach. I just didn't know what to do. A little more than a year later, I found her slumped in her bed, so thin and ice cold. Mr. Jesse was off raving and hollering somewhere, no help at all. I ran and got the doctor, but it was too late. She was buried on a hill in the cemetery. I took her flowers, went to work for the King family down the street. Next thing I know, the sheriff's knocking at my door, arresting me for murder. Me? Murder? No, 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 no! I told him, no, I'd never murder Miss Mary. I love Miss Mary. I'd never kill her. They dug up that poor woman, saying she'd been murdered with arsenic. Arsenic! I never would have given that poor lady arsenic. I heard all the catcalls and yells when they dragged me off to the jailhouse. I almost fainted from fear. They said they were gonna hang me from a tree. Please, sirs, let me go, let me go. I ain't done nothing, I ain't done nothing. But they didn't. Those men went to church, prayed to the Almighty, rang the fire bell, and came after me. The lawyer, Hugh Anderson, begged him to stop. The sheriff tried to stop him. The group was just too large. They stripped me naked and dragged me to the courthouse. Confess, confess, confess what? I ain't done nothing. They bound my hands behind my back and tied my feet together. They threw the rope over the tree branch. I'm innocent were the last words they heard me say. They hung me up and shot me 5 times. Those crazy men. I looked out and I thought, this is what Jesus must have saw when he was nailed to the cross. One day, Mr. Jesse showed up here at my hanging tree, chanting the God Almighty told him to kill somebody to save the souls of his wife and daughter. Took nearly a dozen men to haul him off to jail, then on to the crazy house in Nashville. He confessed to murdering Miss Mary. I was innocent and I died for nothing. His confession didn't bring me back. I'm dead. I just can't seem to leave this place. Maybe I'm just stuck here till the Lord comes.
Next time you're downtown, visit the Madison County Courthouse to view the lynching in Madison County monument. In 2020, the Jackson-Madison County Remembrance Project worked together to honor Miss Eliza Woods and Mr. John Brown, who were wrongfully lynched to death in Jackson. Since you have your hankies handy, I have another heartbreaking ghost story for you.
Oh, hello. Mama says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but well, I like to talk. Besides, y'all look like nice folks. I'm Lillian Sullivan. I lived here in Jackson with my mama and daddy. I never had any brothers or sisters. I loved playing with my dolls, skipping rope, going swimming down at the river, and playing in the woods with neighbor kids. But more than anything, I loved going to the general store on Main Street with Mama. She'd buy me hard candy and sometimes crackers and cheese. We'd also look at the new dress material and hair ribbon together. One day, Mama and I went to the store where she got me the most prettiest red hair ribbon you've ever seen. Then we went to the restaurant next door. She got me a glass of Coca-Cola and some crackers. I love Coca-Cola. It tickles my nose and tummy. In 1895, the railroad brought Coca-Cola here all the way from Atlanta. It was just a nickel a glass. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, the day Mama brought me the pretty red hair ribbon, we sat by the restaurant's big picture window, watching all the people and wagons go by. Jackson's a busy town. The trains stop here, letting people off and letting people on. Folks from all over the world come and go at all hours of day and night. Now, on that particular day, as Mom and I came out of the restaurant, the wind blew through my hair, and it felt so good. But then my ribbon blew away. I was so mad. I wanted my pretty ribbon back. I dropped Mama's hand and ran into the street to fetch it. Then everything became a blur. I heard wagon wheels and horse hooves pounding on the dirt street. I remember getting knocked down, then Mama crying and looking so sad. I saw all these faces over me and people yelling for the doctor. Some man said I had a broken leg, but I didn't feel a thing. Actually, I felt cold all over. Then I was traveling through the clouds towards a bright, bright light. Once in a while, I like to come back to wander the Jackson streets looking for my red hair ribbon. Have you seen it?
Streets are not always safe, so make sure to always look both ways. And drivers, with Halloween upon us, please use caution and be on the lookout for little ghosts and goblins who will be trick-or-treating. I am Duke Bones, and I approve of this public service message. Now, speaking of safety, let's meet the toughest Jackson lawman who ever lived.
Someone once said, there's some good in every man. However, I believe that whoever said that had never been a lawman. Howdy, folks. I'm Tom Gaston. Before I joined the police ranks, I was first a fireman for the Illinois Central Railroad. I knew Casey Jones very well, and I enjoyed firing the locomotives for the IC. Every run was an adventure. Riding the rails was a fun job. But in my off-duty days, I worked part-time as a policeman. This soon became a job I liked more than railroading. Back then, policemen were elected each year. And in 1882, the city wanted to get rid of one of the policemen, so I got elected to the job full-time. The city also elected 3 new policemen. Back then, Jackson was a fairly quiet town. Our main trouble came from the drunks in the saloons. And since Jackson was a railroad hub, we had plenty of both. Well, late one night, during my first week on the job, I heard a terrible ruckus from a saloon near the rail yard. It was Shule, the town drunk. Well, I offered to let him slip it off in the jail, but he refused. He took a swing at me and missed. It was on. I grabbed him and threw him into the street. Well, he took shots at me, I shot back. We both emptied our revolvers without causing a single wound. Well, we continued to fight with knives and fists, and this went on for what seemed like hours. Quite a crowd had gathered to watch it. Well, woozy, I fell to the ground, cut and bruised. And just as Shule was coming in for a devastating blow, I gathered up every ounce of strength I could, jumped up, grabbed a manure shovel that was leaning against the horse trough, and knocked him out cold with it. Well, when Shule woke up in the jail the next morning, he admitted there was another tough guy in town. His name was yours truly. Well, in 1882, I was elected lieutenant of police, second in command to the chief. And the next year, I tried to help the sheriff when a mob was headed to town to free one of their friends from the county jail. Well, one of them fired at me. The bullet tore through my left eye. I put a bullet between his eyes. When the smoke had cleared, one was dead. All the other assailants were wounded. It was quite a battle. Doc removed 16 slugs from my body, not counting the one that was lodged in my skull behind my left eye. He said, "Tom, that bullet's so close to your brain, if I try to remove it, the surgery will kill you." I told him, "Just let it be." Well, I've been in many more gun battles and was shot several times. Newspapers started printing the same headline, "Tom Gaston shot again." Well, in 1892, the good people of Jackson elected me chief of police. And I've always adored horses and always felt that they had a place in providing public service. So I started Tennessee's first mounted police force. Well, year after year, the fine people of Jackson elected me chief of police, and I gladly served. But after being shot so many times, my body began to fall apart. And after my wife Alice died in 1915, I hung up my guns and turned in my badge, and I buried Alice at Riverside Cemetery. Well, when America entered the Great War in 1917, I came out of retirement to serve on the local draft board. But that old eye wound finally got me. February 22nd, 1918. They said I'd had a stroke. Well, my body may be buried at Riverside Cemetery right next to my beloved Alice, but I am still on patrol. Anytime a policeman or a fireman answers a call, a part of me goes with them.
Thank you for your service to the city, Chief. It's good to know he did such a fine job with our early police department and that he's still on patrol. The New Southern Hotel, located on the city square, has a history of being haunted. It was home to many because the railroads brought so many travelers to Jackson. The hotel was a meeting point in our fast-growing town. In the 20s and early 30s, the hotel hosted many parties in the Grand Ballroom. It was a time of jazz music, dancing, illegal booze, and fun. Lucia McKellis lived in the New Southern in the 1930s. She owned one of the first beauty shops in Jackson and opened the city's first beauty school. Her motto for her students, "It's your business to make women beautiful." She was a wealthy woman but lost nearly everything when her husband died in 1921. She still had the beauty school, so she wasn't a pauper. She had a bad gambling habit, and it's rumored she stopped to shoot craps with the gamblers on the sidewalk. She liked to party, and party hard. Some New Southern employees have said when it's late and there's no one in the building, they hear the elevator doors open. Jazz music fills the air, and they hear the voice of Lucia flirting with her date.
Tap, step, 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 do, 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 do. I got rhythm.
I've got music.
I've got my gal.
Who could ask for anything more? Oh, man, trouble. I don't mind him. Won't be finding at my door.
I got rhythm. I got music. I got my gal. Who could ask for anything more? Who could ask for anything more?
Oh, I love that song. Oh, Harry, baby, I didn't know you were so much fun. I'm so glad you're here in Jackson.
Lucia, who would ever have thought that I'd have you on my arm for the night?
Well, this has been the night. Happy you took the train up so we could get together.
I remember in New Orleans the first time I laid eyes on you. You were on Henry's arm, and I thought, what a lucky, lucky guy.
Well, he was lucky. Bless his soul. Then he up and died on me.
I'm sure you miss him.
Well, yeah, I do. Now that you chase my blues away.
But you know, I've enjoyed all this dancing, but I need a break. I'm not a young boy anymore.
Oh, shush. I know lots of 20-year-olds that could not keep up with you.
How many young men do you know?
Harry, you're just terrible.
But you love me anyway.
Yes, I do. Of course I do. Ooh, I'm famished. Can we go for a late supper? You want to go?
Sure. Where would you like to go?
Well, there's a cafe nearby, and they stay open late, and they serve a very good meal.
Hubba hubba, bring on the grubber.
And then we can go for a drive, and I'll let you drive my Model A.
I would chauffeur you anywhere, anytime.
Anywhere?
Absolutely. Anywhere you want to go.
Well, then we'll go to the park, and we'll climb into the rainbow sea, and we'll watch the full moon as long as we want.
I like your style, sugar.
Well, and then we come back here, and we will dance till dawn.
Tango.
Ooh, the dance of love.
T-A-N-G-O.
Sounds like they're enjoying the netherworld just fine. It's fun to think that the partying at the New Southern has never stopped, and the jazz music just keeps on playing. Folks, we're down to our final two ghosts. Judge Hugh Anderson and Sue Shelton White practice law together upstairs in a building on Southern Liberty Street, directly across from the county courthouse. Both of them changed our county, our state, and America. It's my honor to bring out his honor.
When I was 1 year old in 1891, basketball was created. When I was 2 years old, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. When I was 3, Thomas Edison made a silent movie. And when I was 4, Rudyard Kipling wrote The Jungle Book, and I tasted my first Coca-Cola. My mother read The Jungle Book to me, and my love of reading carried me through my life. I've come to the conclusion that so much was destined to happen in America, and perhaps the stars affected my country, my life, and my destiny when I was a young boy. Maybe reading about Sherlock Holmes' detective skills influenced me to enter the law. Sometimes you've got to read between the lines to figure out what's happening. I led a perfect life in Jackson, Tennessee, with good friends and a good education. Yes, I served in the U.S. Army during World War I. War is a great teacher of man's inhumanity to man. It makes our spirits desire justice. I ended up studying for the law. Like many young lawyers in the state, I worked as Assistant Attorney General, and Prosecuting Attorney. In my practice, I was fortunate to have Sue Shelton White join me for a period of time. She had such a brilliant legal mind. My wife and I were quite fond of her, even though she was determined to be outspoken about women's suffrage. We supported her beliefs, but it wasn't easy for Sue White. Politics called to me, and I became a delegate to the Democratic National Convention from Tennessee in 1912 as an alternate, and then again in 1924 and in 1936. Then I was elected to a state senator and served from 1931 to 33. It was not an easy time in Tennessee for politics. Governor Henry Horton had placed $6 million in state funds in the banks owned by Luke Lee and Roger Caldwell. They were declared insolvent due to the crash of '29. It was a major loss of state funds. The legislature voted to impeach the governor, but the measure did not carry, so he served out his term. Before he left office in 1933, Governor Horton appointed me to the Tennessee Court of Appeals. I became presiding judge in 1942, and I stayed there except for my service in Germany in 1947 and 48 on the Krupp's Tribunal. I can tell you, the Krupp case was challenging and exhausting. The stories of the horrific war crimes would leave my soul distraught at day's end while I worked to ensure a fair trial. The Nuremberg Library was of no help due to the bombings. Yes, my ulcers acted up. I was ready to come home to Jackson, Tennessee. I wanted to read books to my granddaughter. She loved the handcrafted dolls I brought her from Germany. I just wanted to watch her grow up. But we don't get to choose the time we have. 5 years later, I passed from this life to the next. I had my mind on a newspaper article the morning of May 5th, 1953. The elevator was always waiting for me in the courthouse. I opened the door, still reading my paper, and stepped forward. But we had an early visitor to the courthouse that morning, and the elevator was on the 3rd floor. I landed at the bottom of the elevator shaft. I don't remember much after that except for the pain and the young man who was sent down to wrap ropes around me and pull me up. I was sorry to leave my wife, Virginia. I keep an eye on all the comings and goings at the courthouse. I've thought about picking up the gavel and throwing it at a dunderhead criminal or two, but I haven't done that yet. And I do whisper a few words into the lawyers' heads now and then. They think they've come up with brilliant legal strategies. Well, I do what I can in the name of the law.
Whew, what an awful way to go. Accidents unfortunately do happen. In 2017, a portrait honoring Judge Anderson was placed in Madison County Courthouse. Next time you're renewing your license plate or have any official business, stop for a moment to admire the painting. Our final ghostly visit is from a woman who is definitely a legend, not just locally, but nationally. She accomplished much during her life, working tirelessly for women's right to vote. That woman, Sue Shelton White. Now, without further ado, here's the legend herself.
I've been speaking on the street corner for a long time now. I began when I joined the National Women's Party, long before 1920. Thank you for stopping to listen. Time was, men would tell me, some of them, to go home, be quiet, and cook and clean. I did a lot of cooking and cleaning as a girl, helping my mother. My father was a minister and a school superintendent, and we didn't have much. We had even less when he died. There's nothing wrong with good, honest work in the home, but I saw my mother work herself to death. Before that, she made sure that my sister and brother and I had a great education. We studied Shakespeare, Latin, and Greek, and all of the classics. I went to Georgia Robertson College and West Tennessee Business School. I was more than prepared. I worked for a while at Southern Engine and Boiler Works here in Jackson. I was a secretary. I had some good ideas about how things could be done better. The men wouldn't listen. I was wasting my time. So I left. I followed in my sister Lucy's footsteps and became a court reporter. I had my own office. Still, there was more that needed to be done. Women needed to own property and to have a bit for themselves after their husbands died. Women needed to vote. If women could vote, things could change for the better. I joined the Tennessee Equal Suffrage League in about 1910. We formed 75 different organizations throughout the state. After a while, though, I found that speaking and meeting were not getting the job done. Despite Lucy's disapproval, I joined the National Women's Party. We published a newspaper. I was the editor. It was called The Suffragist. We called out people who were against women voting. It was the right thing to do. About this time, our nation was involved in World War I, fighting a war for democracy. On February the 19th, 1919, my friends and I were engaged in a peaceful protest outside the White House. It was bitterly cold. We had a fire. I burned an image of President Wilson in that fire. He had backed up on his promise to support women's suffrage. For that stunt, I got 5 days in jail. We used it to our advantage, though. Our party rented a train that we called the Prison Special that we rode from coast to coast. That and the women's help in the war effort and whatever else that caused the suffrage amendment to finally pass the House and the Senate in 1919. Soon, several states had ratified, but by the spring of 1920, the ratification had stalled. It came down to my home state of Tennessee. In a hot summer of August 1920, the battle moved to Nashville. My friends and I moved into the Hermitage Hotel. We wore yellow roses for suffrage. We tracked down and talked to all the members of the General Assembly. Our opponents wore red roses. I was accused of being immoral and of causing the decline of the South. I held my tongue, but I wanted to tell the accusers that they should look in the mirror. By the thinnest of margins, we won that vote. My friends and I showered the House chamber of the General Assembly, the Capitol, with yellow rose petals. Tennessee became the perfect 36, and the 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution. Because of that, we still have the vote today. I went to Washington as a secretary for Senator McKellar. While I was doing that, I went to law school, graduated. In 1926, I came back to Jackson. I practiced with Hugh Anderson, who would later become a judge. I was a member of Jackson Madison chapter, Daughters of the American Revolution, and I was president of Jackson Business and Professional Women. I was still a little restless, though, when President Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor asked me to come to Washington early in the 30s. I jumped at the chance. They wanted to work on the Social Security Administration. I remembered what happened to my mother. I was able to do that and work in other New Deal agencies. But in 1943, cancer, the great leveler, ended all of that. I come back to Jackson frequently. Hugh Anderson joins me from the great beyond. He and I talk about the court cases of the day. He likes to go to the courtroom and tap the lawyers on the shoulder. I like to go near the bust of me outside City Hall. It's located close to where our law office was located. It was sculpted by very talented Wanda Stanfield. I face east, as does the bust, toward Nashville and Washington, where I served my country.
Thank you, Miss White, for your hard work in life and spending time with us tonight. Folks, next time you're downtown, visit City Hall. In 2017, a bronze sculpture of Miss White was erected in City Hall Plaza by the Sue Shelton White Memorial Committee. As they say at the Mummy Factory, that's a wrap. Our ghosts have retired for the night, and I must return to the ghostly netherworld. I hope you enjoyed our time together as much as I have. And now, with a final word or two, here's our host, Mary Jo Middlebrooks.
Jackson Area Business and Professional Women thanks Chris Stevens and his talented players. We also thank Lane College and the Mass Media Film students for helping us with their most valuable talent. Finally, a great thank you to Channel 6 for airing this production. Next year, we hope to see you in downtown Jackson for the Ghost Tour and dinner.